All right, welcome back now. Sounds like we're going to have musical accompaniment today. I guess with everyone at home, people are getting trying to entertain themselves. Okay, hope there's no problem joining back. It looks like this is a set link now, this 3917674 number. So let's start. We discussed equality and yesterday justice and liberty. Now we move on to fraternity. I don't know if you had the chance to look at D.D. Basu's commentary on the preamble. I'd sent you the link for it. I didn't send you the link for it. I'm sorry. I sent you the title, and I was hoping that you'd be able, you'd be able to follow it online. What I did discover is that I have a scanned copy of it. So I'll, in case you weren't able to find Basu's commentary on the Constitution online, and I'm assuming you, maybe most of you are at home and not on campus, and even if you're on campus, you're not supposed to go to the library. I don't really know the situation, but if you've not been able to see Basu's commentary on the Constitution, specifically the chapter on the preamble, then I'm going to send you a scanned copy of it. I'm not actually, maybe it's the wrong thing to do because I'm not sending it to you because you are going to learn so much from it. I'm sending it to you because it is taught at every law school, and Basu seems really to have no idea what he's talking about when it comes to the preamble. And this is most apparent in terms of the Fraternity Clause, because Basu's commentary on the Fraternity Clause is sort of borders on the ridiculous, because he just doesn't know what to make of it, where it came from, and so on, since he never apprised himself of the mechanics of the drafting process of the preamble. If you check any history of the Constitution, any commentary on the preamble, they all vaguely gloss over the appearance of the term fraternity, and this elision gives you the impression that the term simply came from nowhere, like it just fell out of the sky. And while that's completely wrong, as we've learned the last couple of days about exactly who wrote it in and how it managed to remain in there despite not being in the objectives resolution. Still, there's a good reason to understand why no one has been able to make sense of it, because when we think about documents like the Constitution, the preamble, being based essentially on various harvestings of other prior acts and legislation, Government of India Act 1935, and of course existing constitutions and preambles from around the world. When we look at what source documents went into the drafting of the Constitution and the preamble, we don't find the word fraternity anywhere. So going back to the beginning, Congress Working Committee's Expert Committee Declaration of July 1946, where we get the Justice Clause and some of the words from equality and some of the freedoms and so on, it doesn't mention the word fraternity. And NATO's Objectives Resolution that was passed on 22 Jan 1947, it didn't mention it. And B.N. Rao's preliminary draft constitution, which formed the basis of what the drafting committee was working with, that did not mention the word fraternity. And every source document that was influential, from each of them, the term fraternity is absent. And that goes all the way back to that 1930 Indian National Congress famous declaration on Purna Swaraj that I had spoken about, which influenced the date that the Constitution was adopted, 26 Jan. And that includes the 1935 Government of India Act, from which our Constitution very liberally borrowed. If you remember, what is it, some 135 articles or something like that come from there. Now, I have been talking about all of those above documents. What I have neglected to speak of so far is something I think that is very interesting, which is the number of rival constitutions that were floating around in the 1940s. And in fact, some produced at the same time as the draft constitution of India. I've already spoken of states and minorities as Ambedkar's constitution for the United States of India, but there were several others, and several others by members of the Constituent Assembly as well. Now, one important one is the Gandhian Constitution of Free India. That was published in 1946 by Sriman Narayan Agarwal, and it included a foreword by Gandhi himself. Then there was, and of course that didn't include the word fraternity. There was M.N. Roy's Constitution of Free India, a draft that was published in 1944 by the Radical Democratic Party. And I mentioned M.N. Roy when we were speaking of equality. M.N. Roy is the author of Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Ancient China, someone whom Ambedkar, in fact, knew personally. There's a very funny story because M.N. Roy came to Ambedkar in disguise because he was there was an arrest warrant against him, and Ambedkar wasn't able to recognize him at first. But anyway, M.N. Roy produced this Constitution of Free India, or rather the party, Radical Democratic Party did. M.N. Roy wrote the foreword to it. And then in March 1948, so that's right in the middle of the Constituent Assembly and the drafting of the Constitution, the Socialist Party of India prepared its own draft called Draft Constitution of the Indian Republic. So here we have the Socialist Party producing a rival constitution during the drafting of the Indian Constitution. And as usual, always producing something rival, J. Prakash Narayan wrote the foreword for that Socialist Party's draft constitution. Now, the Socialist Party, who of course wanted to nationalize industry, they condemned the Constituent Assembly's draft constitution because it fell short of economic equalitarian ideas. But the party followed, that's the Socialist Party. The Socialist Party followed the Constituent Assembly's draft very closely in terms of structure and headings. It included fundamental rights, and it even included directive principles of state policy. But it did not include a fraternity clause. So the Gandhians didn't have it. M.N. Roy's party, Radical Democratic Party, didn't have it. The Socialist Party didn't have it. And none of the earlier writings of Nehru or B.N. Rao or the Congress Working Committee's drafts, none of them had this term fraternity. So this is in some respects why people like Basu and most constitutional historians don't know what to make of the Fraternity Clause, precisely because the writing of the preamble is attributed to everybody except Ambedkar, and all of those people had never mentioned fraternity at all. Now, what's interesting is that although Ambedkar introduced the concept of fraternity totally out of the blue, And as we're going to see shortly, it was part of what he had to justify in his 21 February letter to the President of the Constituent Assembly, because obviously it's not in the objectives resolution, it's added. So although Ambedkar took a risk in introducing this novel term, it turned out that unlike all of the other clauses of the Constitution, quality clauses and so on, instead of being ripped apart either for being too centrist, for being too Western, for being non-Gandhian, in fact, everybody in the Constituent Assembly praised the Fraternity Clause. So once again, we get a second time of unanimous cheering and applause for Dr. Ambedkar. The first time when he's criticizing the objectives resolution in the Constituent Assembly before he lost his seat as a result of partition, when he calls for unity. There are cheers and bat-packing and all of this, and he's seen as a great statesman despite his long-standing criticism of Congress. And the second time when he introduces fraternity. So I'm going to read you what Bhargav, Thakur Das Bhargav from East Punjab says about the Fraternity Clause, because it's interesting how much of a nemesis Bhargav was to Ambedkar. On the last day of the Constituent Assembly, before it's going to vote on the Constitution in the third reading, Dr. Ambedkar identifies people he calls rebels, the rebels of the Constituent Assembly. And he mentions these rebels by name, which is very, very fascinating and also gives us a sense of the meaning of fraternity, but we'll talk about that later. And one of the contrarian rebels was Bhargav, who Ambedkar says always kept him on his toes because he would never let him introduce any article without giving a full juridical and philosophical justification of it. Now, here's what Bhargav says about the Fraternity Clause. He says this, by the way, during the first reading on 6 November 1948. I think that the soul of this Constitution is contained in the Preamble, and I am glad to express my sense of gratitude to Dr. Ambedkar for having added the word fraternity to the Preamble. Now, I want to apply the touchstone of the Preamble to the entire Constitution. If justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity are to be found in this Constitution, if we can get this ideal, justice, liberty, equality, fraternity from the Preamble through this Constitution, then I maintain that this Constitution is good. Insofar as these things which are contained in the Preamble are wanting, then I am bound to say that this Constitution is wanting. And it is from this angle that I want to judge the Constitution. This is interesting because Bhargav, as I mentioned, is a constant nemesis of Ambedkar. And yet, just like Ambedkar, he realizes, or rather, I should say, just like my interpretation of Ambedkar's Preamble, Bhargav realizes that these terms, justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, are the lens through which we should interpret the entire spirit of the Constitution. Now, J.B. Kriplani, who I mentioned 2 or 3 times in the past, chairman of subcommittee on fundamental rights and also known as a conscience keeper of Gandhi in the Constituent Assembly, he was one of the main critics of the non-Gandhian character of what Ambedkar had introduced into the Constituent Assembly. And what the Fraternity Clause manages to do, which is very, very interesting, is it manages to allow those people who had objected to the non-Gandhian character of the Constitution in general and the Preamble in particular to read into it a sort of Gandhianism. So Kriplani, who was always a critique of Ambedkar with respect to the attempts to incorporate Gandhian principles, says this about the Fraternity Clause. Again, I come to the great doctrine of fraternity, which is allied with democracy. It means, so now, sorry, I'm interrupting the reading Kriplani's statement in the Constituent Assembly, but I just want to emphasize, Kriplani is giving his own reading of fraternity, which is different from Ambedkar's, but this is what we refer to as overlapping consensus. Now, someone who's opposed to Ambedkar comes to support the Fraternity Clause because he reads in it different justifications behind it. Now back to Kriplani's speech. It means that we are all sons of the same God, as the religious would say, but as the mystic would say, that there is one life pulsating through us all, or as the Bible says, we are one of another. There can be no fraternity without this. So I want this House to remember that what we have enunciated are not merely legal, constitutional, formal principles, but moral principles. And moral principles have got to be lived in life. They have to be lived whether it is private life or it is public life, whether it is commercial life, political life, or the life of an administrator. They have to be lived throughout. These things we have to remember if our Constitution is to succeed. So it's really amazing how this Fraternity Clause managed to bring unity to the Constituent Assembly. What in Rawls's political philosophy is called sort of an occasion for overlapping consensus, because everybody is behind fraternity, but they are all behind it for their own reasons. Okay. But as I'd mentioned, the Fraternity Clause was sort of drafted out of the blue. So when Dr. Ambedkar on 21 February 1948 sends the complete draft to Prasad, he encloses an important cover note, which I've mentioned a couple of times. And in that cover note, he explains the drafting committee's methods and their decisions. And there is finally a clear and forthright confession of the departure from the objectives resolution, along with the justification for that departure. Now, why am I emphasizing that? If you remember, on 10th February 1948, after the drafting committee sort of soberly awoke from its thrill of the 6th to 9th of how they've created such a brilliant preamble, they awoke to the realization that they were supposed to just append the objectives resolution, but they didn't. They wrote something new. So they had put that footnote stating that they had followed the objectives resolution, which, as I have mentioned, was clearly not true. It was a kind of dissembling, suggesting that if you just say that you're doing something, that people will believe that you're doing it. Instead, they realized not to do that. They removed the footnote, and instead Ambedkar wrote a letter that indeed we have departed from the objectives resolution. And this is what, in part, Dr. Ambedkar's note to defend his departure from the objectives resolution read when he wrote to the President of the Constituent Assembly. The committee has added a clause about fraternity in the preamble, although it does not occur in the objectives resolution. The committee felt that the need for fraternal concord and goodwill in India was never greater than now, and that this particular aim of the new constitution should be emphasized by special mention in the preamble. Now, this was the right decision, of course, to come clean, and as I noted, everybody in the Constituent Assembly was quite thrilled about this new introduction, and indeed it led, everyone thanked Ambedkar by name, even though Ambedkar in his letter said it was done by the committee, and this enhanced Ambedkar's charisma, the respect that he received in the Constituent Assembly. Everybody already knew about his oratorial skill, his dexterous wit, and his encyclopedic knowledge. People continuously commented on, if you want to know a law or a statute or a clause. Just consult Encyclopedia Ambedkar. But what they learned here now was the introduction of this clause, giving a new sense of the orientation, the unity, fraternal concord and goodwill that Ambedkar was trying to steer through in the preamble of the Constitution. So there's a passage here in Ambedkar's note. It says, fraternal concord, the need for fraternal concord is never greater than now. And that's an obvious allusion to the ongoing tragedies in the wake of partition. But there's another underlying discord in Dr. Ambedkar's mind as he writes this note. And that's not just partition, but that's the contentious and divisive omnipresence of caste. That's what we were talking about in the previous hour. Given the battery of assaults on Brahmanism and Brahminical patriarchy that are inscribed into the body of the Constitution that Dr. Ambedkar encloses with this note, as well as what he's unleashing through the Hindu Code Bill, because the Hindu Code Bill is also running through the Constituent Assembly and its role as provisional parliament. And Ambedkar is writing it. So obviously, with the Hindu Code Bill, with the Hindu Code Bill's attack on Brahminical patriarchy, with the Equality Clause's attack on graded inequality in Brahmanism, these are the reasons that fraternal concord and goodwill in India is never greater than now, because of what is being introduced in 1950 in this revolution that is the Constitution. So Dr. Ambedkar wrote that we need fraternal concord in his book Revolution and Counter-Revolution because Brahmanism was divisive to the core of Indian society. So I'll read that passage. By the denial of education to the Shudras, by diverting the Kshatriyas to military pursuits and the Vaishyas to trade, and by reserving education to themselves, the Brahmins alone could become the educated class, thereby free to misdirect and misguide all of society. By converting Varna into caste, they declared that mere birth was a real and final measure of the worth of a person. Caste and graded inequality made disunity and discord a matter of course. And so consequently, if this is what they're trying to overturn, what they need is unity and concord. And it's quite fascinating because these are the two speeches of Ambedkar that received so much applause, his speech on unity and his speech on fraternity and goodwill. So just to summarize that, this long march towards the annihilation of caste and its inauguration through a radically egalitarian assault by means of this new constitutional law, this assault on the ubiquitous and millennia-old social law of graded inequality was obviously not going to be free of violence. And as I hope you are well enough informed to know, caste atrocities are a commonplace day after day after day and continue to be in this country. And so bloodshed, tragedy is to be expected in the wake of this revolution that is a constitution, because it is changing the nature of our social norms in a time when we are ideologically gripped by a counter-revolutionary, inegalitarian ideology. So, again, the need for fraternal concord and goodwill in India is never greater than now. This is why Ambedkar wrote those words in the letter to the President of the Constituent Assembly. But now, that was 21 Feb 1948, was not the first time that Dr. Ambedkar spoke of fraternity. While all of the available source documents that either formally or informally came to bear upon the content of the Constitution of India, I mean formally and informally as in Objectives Resolution, Government of India Act, and the borrowed preamble and content of Germany and Ireland and the United States and so on. While these were free of this concept, the idea of fraternity was a very constant one in Dr. Ambedkar's writings. And if you study all of his work, going back to his early paper on castes in India, what we find is a continuously evolving reference to the word fraternity. In fact, I would argue that the centrality of the idea of fraternity to Ambedkar's thought can't be overestimated. And in that respect, we have to understand the centrality of fraternity to the preamble and to the nature of constitutional law. Ambedkar didn't only appeal to fraternity in the drafting committee and in the Constituent Assembly debates, that is, in the period from 1947 to 1950, but he also made judicious use of the term fraternity all the way back in Annihilation of Caste in 1936. And then you can see the word, you can follow the use of the word fraternity in The Philosophy of Hinduism, another little book that Ambedkar wrote when, I think he wrote it when he was working on the Hindu Code Bill, that's 1947 to 1951. And it also appeared in books like Riddles in Hinduism, which I think Ambedkar wrote between 1951 and 1953 after he resigned from the cabinet. And then, as we're going to talk about, in a very important All India Radio interview in 1954, he speaks on fraternity. And then just a couple of weeks before he dies, he gives this talk in 1956 in Kathmandu, and he talks about love and justice. And there he speaks of fraternity. And then in the book I was talking about earlier, The Buddha and His Dhamma, which was published in 1957, there he speaks about fraternity. So what I'm trying to point out is from 1936 to 1956, the word fraternity is in every significant writing of Dr. Ambedkar, 36 to 56. So when it appears on 6 February 1948, it might be a mystery to people like Basu who are looking at other sources behind the writing of the Constitution and the Preamble. But it is no mystery to anyone who understands Ambedkar's fundamental role in drafting the Fraternity Clause of the Preamble. Now, with so much usage and in so many different contexts, it's kind of hard to say exactly what fraternity means, but we can sort of piece it together. And I think essentially what we want to get at is what Dr. Ambedkar declared on All India Radio in 1954. So I'm going to read what Dr. Ambedkar says. My social philosophy may be said to be enshrined in 3 words: liberty, equality, and fraternity. So basically the preamble represents his social philosophy. Let no one, however, say that I have borrowed my philosophy from the French Revolution. I have not. My philosophy has its roots in religion and not in political science. I have derived them from the teachings of my master, the Buddha. Now, this kind of claim in 1954 would strike anyone who sees, on the one hand, liberty, equality, and fraternity as being imported Western concepts. It would strike them as bizarre, and it would strike anyone as unimaginable who doesn't understand the way that we have discussed equality in the previous hour as arising from the long history of the struggle for equality and against inequality that was inaugurated with the Buddha in the 6th century and continued throughout Indian history, with the Bhakti movement and so on. So if this is the final characterization of the nature of fraternity, that it derives from the Buddha. Let's see how he talks about liberty and equality in this respect. Now, I'm going to reverse here, because what I've been trying to show is that these concepts, liberty, equality, fraternity, have indigenous origin, that the way that Ambedkar changes freedom to liberty and what he means by liberty vis-a-vis the Swaraj movement is characterizing the concept of liberty in the preamble in a totally Indian indigenous context. And in the last hour, as I discussed equality in terms of revolution and counter-revolution in ancient India, that discusses and contextualizes equality in a completely Indian context. And if we see fraternity as deriving from Buddhist philosophy, as Ambedkar claims, that puts it in an indigenous context. So liberty, equality, and fraternity have been articulated, as far as I have been speaking on the preamble, in terms of the Indian context. But what we want to look at now is to step back out to the more mainstream understanding of the problems posed by these core principles of liberty and equality in the Western world, and see how they were dealt with in the history of Western political theory, just so we can recuperate a sense of what is going on in the preamble. Now, before I start doing that, I think I'll go ahead and end this meeting, because it's about to cut out anyway, and then we'll rejoin, and I will start discussing this idea of liberty, equality, fraternity in Western political philosophy. All right, so we're coming back. Actually, I realized I made the same mistake yesterday, because I was worried about it cutting off in the middle, that going to have to do it one more time before the 1 o'clock dismissal. But anyway, let's get started again. All right, I expect that sometime in your academic career you have studied at least a little bit about John Rawls, because I don't have time really to discuss Rawls's thought, but it's fairly important in a few different ways. And I know you're not political theorists or political philosophers, so some of this is going to be to stretch your imagination a little bit. Now, I don't know if you've heard of the political philosopher Akhil Bilgrami. Writes a lot on Gandhi and on secularism. He's at Columbia University. Very, very brilliant and kind man. Akhil comes to India like all NRIs, OCIs. He comes to India in December, Jan, Feb, when India gets filled with all of the American Indians in America and so on. And he always gives the same lecture. I don't know if you've heard him speak. He travels all around. In fact, he's from Hyderabad. I think, if I understand his family history, he's some sort of aristocratic relationship to the rulers of Hyderabad in the past. Anyway, so some of you might have encountered him. He gives this constant lecture when he's talking about Gandhi about how it's really ironic and perverse that the two cardinal principles of all of Western political philosophy are antagonistic to one another. That is liberty and equality. And they appear as a zero-sum phenomenon in Western political philosophy, because the more you increase liberty, the more you decrease equality. The more you increase equality, the more you decrease liberty. So reconciling liberty and equality has been an intractable difficulty in Western political philosophy, because just increasing one implies a decrease in the other, but both are necessary in equal measure. So there are, of course, a lot of smaller factions who come down just in support of one over the other, like libertarians, right? Libertarians who champion liberty no matter what. You can ask a libertarian about, well, what about social welfare or the chronically ill or whatever, and they just sort of look at you blankly with this, what you see behind their eyes is this kind of social Darwinism that they don't want to utter in public. And then the hardcore egalitarians who prioritize equality even at the expense of individual liberty. But instead of these kind of more radical positions, the large-scale tendency has been to attempt to overcome this zero-sum scenario. And so in the long history of political theory, let's just start with a modern, we don't want to go back all the way to the ancient world. You can see in someone like Thomas Hobbes, you've probably heard of the Leviathan, that he uses the overwhelming might of the strong state, the sovereign, gigantic and awesome like a Leviathan. He uses this Leviathan to suppress the conflicts that emerge in the demands of liberty and equality. So that's a kind of external solution, but more political theorists have used an attempted internal solution where citizens themselves bear responsibility for resolving the conflict between liberty and equality, the conflicting claims of liberty and equality. And this has been done in two broad ways. One, which I call affective, like emotional, and one which we can call cognitive or rational. So the affective or the cognitive ways of internally burdening citizens themselves with the task of resolving the seemingly inherent tension between liberty and equality, even though they are our two core values in a democracy. So economists like Adam Smith, you know Adam Smith, of course, and some of you who are educated in philosophy might know David Hume. Both of them developed theories of moral sentiments, which offered the ways of negotiating between the different demands of social, economic, and political conflict that arise between this moral sentiment is an affective way of resolving the problem. We're not going to talk about that. And then on the other hand, there's the German philosopher Immanuel Kant and his later successor, George Hegel, who attempted to resolve the incommensurability of liberty and equality, not through an affective way, but through the natural capacities of human reason. Okay, so through a cognitive way. Now, I apologize to you if you're scratching your head. Why has Aakash started going into political philosophy in this kind of detail? What I'm trying to show you or illustrate to you is that the tension between liberty and equality that I have been discussing in the internal Indian context is amplified because in the Western context, for those of us who have been led to believe that the terms like liberty and equality of our Constitution come from the Western world, if you are going to believe that, then you need to see that there is a conflict there as well, a conflict that has yet to be solved between the demands of liberty and equality. So political philosophers who are largely responsible for the ideas, the thoughts that go in to justify the nature of constitutional democracies have been struggling with the attempt to resolve this impasse. The most celebrated political theorist of the 20th century is, of course, John Rawls. And the very year that Dr. Ambedkar died, 1956, John Rawls starts thinking about how to reconcile the main traditions, that is the cognitive tradition like Kant and Hegel, or the affective tradition like Hume and Adam Smith, how to reconcile these main traditions with these main principles, liberty and equality, in a Western parliamentary democracy. So what John Rawls' political theory or his idea of justice is all about is to try to reconcile liberty and equality, and to do so in a way that also reconciles the cognitive and the affective ways of reconciling liberty and equality that have characterized the different traditions of Western political thought. So he did this in a couple of ways. I hope you've been introduced to Rawls, so this isn't all a constant struggle for you, what I'm saying right now. He did this first by trying to find a fusion in the cognitive and affective capacities of people. If you remember, he says that the human person is characterized by rationality and reasonability. So the rationality is the cognitive capacity, and the reasonability is that affective tendency towards social cooperation and an inbuilt sense of justice. And the next step was to harmonize the essential institutions of parliamentary democracy in a way that optimized these dual inbuilt capacities of citizens, laying down structures of legal and political and social life that made justice possible. And not just possible subjectively, internal to people and citizens, but possible objectively at the level of the state. So if humans have inbuilt cognitive and affective capacities to be both rational and reasonable, then we have the capacity to harmonize the conflicting demands of liberty and equality, not only within ourselves, but also in public institutions. Now, this is how Rawls is trying to solve this incommensurability problem that people like Akhil Bigrami keep repeating over and over again as being, as plaguing all of Western thought. Now, why I am saying this, why do I blend Ambedkar's phraseology into Rawls's project, this attempt to reconcile the principles and institutions of democracy with the nature and capacities of the human person, is to highlight something that very few political historians or political theorists have recognized, which is that the greatest academic philosopher of the Western world in the 20th century, at least of the United States, was wrestling in the same year, 1956, in the area of political theory with what, in the very same year, the author of the Fraternity Clause of the Constitution of India was wrestling with in political practice. And I don't think this is a small thing for us to realize as let's say, as legal or political thinkers. Now, there's a huge asymmetry, of course, to evaluate Rawls' success and Ambedkar's success, because Rawls' success is just done through peer-reviewed journals and so on, while Ambedkar's success is judged with blood and sweat and violence and things like that. But still, we have to keep in mind that by inheriting the political institutions of Western parliamentary democracy, as India did on 26 Jan 1950, that means that India necessarily inherits the incommensurability problem that plagues its foundational principles. So in other words, no matter what I have to say about the indigenous origins and the way that the concepts play out in terms of liberty and equality, no matter what I have to say about that, given that we have inherited parliamentary forms, institutions, Western parliamentary democracy, it means that we do not only have to deal with our own internal problems, it means that we also have to solve the incommensurability problems that plague Western parliamentary democracy. So you see, as usual, we have to do two things: solve our own internal problems that arise natively, and solve the external problems. That asymmetry, as I hope you know, characterizes Indian, especially intellectual and academic life, because in India, not only do we have to master our internal systems, but we have to constantly keep up with the academic production and, in fact, jurisprudence of the Western world. You won't find the U.S. Supreme Court citing the Indian Supreme Court, but you will always find the Indian Supreme Court citing the U.S. Supreme Court. So that puts this asymmetrical burden on us to keep track of all internal developments as well as external developments. When we're talking about framing the preamble, we're doing the same thing. We have to solve not only the internal problems, but the external problems as well. Now, Ambedkar sought recourse to the concept of fraternity in an effort to address the commensurability problem between liberty and equality. We see this in a lot of his writings, where he depicted fraternity as the basic principle which sustains both equality and liberty. So I'll just give you an example. What year is this? I've forgotten where Ambedkar says this, but I'll read his quote. "Without fraternity, liberty would destroy equality, and equality would destroy liberty. If in democracy, liberty does not destroy equality and equality does not destroy liberty, it is only because at the basis of both there is fraternity. Fraternity is therefore the root of democracy." All right, so the conceptual problem is to be solved. The conceptual commensurability problem is to be solved by the concept of fraternity. But there's not much at stake, really, in the conceptual problem, other than apprehending that it can be done intellectually. What's more serious is the institutional problem, that is, harmonizing actual human beings, given what they are, in actual democratic institutions that embody constitutional principles. So what Ambedkar discovered, and it took some time, was that the commensurability problem existed only on one plane, whereas the practical problem entailed the institutionalization of democratic principles. And that exists at two interrelated planes simultaneously. Now, what I'm talking about here is that we have to solve not only theoretical problem about the nature of the commensurability of liberty and equality in terms of the political theory that legitimizes the democratic state. All of that is fine. We also have to make an actually existing democracy function. And that is a different problem altogether. Now, what is the way that Dr. Ambedkar attended to the latter? Here we see that it starts on 6 February 1948, when the preamble first sees the light of day. And the way that Dr. Ambedkar thinks about this passage, this Fraternity Clause, continues to evolve throughout each of his speeches. That means the 4th November 1948 motion in the Constituent Assembly, which started the first reading of the draft Constitution. The 25 November 1949 speech in the Constituent Assembly that brought the third reading of the Constitution to a close and initiated the final vote and adoption of the Constitution the following day. And the 27 September 1951 speech where Dr. Ambedkar resigns from the cabinet because of the failure of the Hindu Code Bill to pass. So each of these historic addresses includes this kind of bone-chilling rhetoric, which I find very much analogous to, you probably know Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. There's this sort of bone-chilling rhetoric there in each of these speeches, and I want to talk about what Ambedkar is saying in these speeches. Now, if I have lost you or bored you to tears talking about the political theory, I will now wake you up talking about a concept that everybody uses, and in fact overuses, which is constitutional morality. Because constitutional morality is the term that Ambedkar introduces on his 4th November 1948 speech inaugurating the first reading. Maybe I will quickly read the relevant passage, this famous appeal for constitutional morality, although you've probably had enough of it over the years. Here it is. While everybody recognizes the necessity of the diffusion of constitutional morality for the peaceful working of a democratic constitution, there are two things interconnected with it which are not, unfortunately, generally recognized. One is that the form of administration has a close connection with the form of the Constitution. The form of the administration must be appropriate to and in the same sense as the form of the Constitution. The other is that it is perfectly possible to pervert the Constitution without changing its form by merely changing the form of the administration and to make it inconsistent and opposed to the spirit of the Constitution. It follows that it is only where people are saturated with constitutional morality, such as the one described by Grote, the historian, that one can take the risk of omitting from the Constitution details of administration and leaving it for the legislature to prescribe them. The question is, can we presume such a diffusion of constitutional morality? Constitutional morality is not a natural sentiment. It has to be cultivated. We must realize that our people have yet to learn it. Democracy in India is only a top dressing on an Indian soil which is essentially undemocratic. Now, we spent the entire first hour talking about the graded inequality which characterizes the ideology, philosophy, literature, epics of Indian social and everyday life. And the Constitution, the revolution that is imposed now through the Constitution, is a top dressing. It is now going to be pressed down upon Indian social life. But Indian social life is essentially undemocratic. And so how will the Constitution's egalitarian principles seep in, when it's only a topsoil, into the essentially undemocratic social life of India? So this top dressing on an Indian soil is an articulation of a different kind of incommensurability. We have the conceptual incommensurability from Western political theory about liberty versus equality, and now we have an actual incommensurability in Indian in the attempt to produce an actual document for the functioning of Indian democracy that shows an incommensurability between institutions and persons as social beings. So institutions like he brings in the parliament, legislature, and the administration, the bureaucracy. So institutions like parliament and bureaucracy, where the persons who occupy the positions of MP or IAS or IPS, where are their social values derived from? Their social values, their culture, their upbringing is not derived top down from the Constitution. It is derived bottom up from an inegalitarian soil. In other words, caste and patriarchal practices. So what we have is that irrespective of how perfect our Constitution may be, it will be subverted if constitutional morality does not replace the average inegalitarian morality that seeps up from the long history of our inegalitarian social life. And our MPs and MLAs and IAS officers and bureaucrats and police officers and so on are all bound to be practicing caste, practicing patriarchy, because their values and customs don't derive from the Constitution, they derive from the social order. So that is a new incommensurability problem, one that means much more than the conceptual one. How is that commensurability problem to be solved? Constitutional morality. Constitutional morality is the call for public officials and public servants to transcend the values and principles that they've been imbrued with in Indian social life, and instead adopt the values and principles laid out before them very succinctly in the Preamble: liberty and equality. So fraternity as constitutional morality is the commensurability of Indian social life with its inegalitarian practices, with the new legal and political order with its radical egalitarianism. Now, what Dr. Ambedkar called constitutional morality then is in fact what John Rawls called the idea of public reason in its strict sense. I won't go too much into the Rawls thing. I hope you know this idea of public reason in Rawls. What we find in usual discourse about constitutional morality, for example, there's a famous article by Pratap Bhanumehta, very brilliant person and a friend. I don't want to criticize him in any way, but he has produced a work that displays this usual public reason. Okay. Pratap has published a work that displays the usual misunderstanding of constitutional morality, which is that everybody, including the Supreme Court in the Naz Foundation decision, that everybody wants to perpetuate, which is the belief, mistakenly, that constitutional morality is for everybody. It's not. Just like public reason in John Rawls is for public officials, in the strict sense, constitutional morality for Ambedkar is for public officials. It is the making commensurate of the constitutional values and principles, in other words, the morality that is put forward by the radical egalitarianism of the Constitution, making that commensurate with the social background of everyone who becomes a public official. So if you ever studied international relations, you would know that this concept of realism in international relations, which as one of its corollaries has an attack on the liberal theory of institutions. The liberal theory of institutions more or less believes that institutions are agents, whereas realists clap back that institutions are fictions that are run by particular persons. So when, for example, the ICSSR Western Regional Center, I happen to have an invite from that organization right in front of me, which is why I thought of it. When the ICSSR Western Regional Center writes an honorarium check to me, it was a human being, a particular person, who signs this check, who writes this check, even though it is written on behalf of an institution. But the realist points out that the morality, the behavior, the arbitrary decisions of that individual are very, very important in respect to understanding the nature of that institution. So what public reason, and in this case constitutional morality, is about is making commensurate the rational decision-making of agents of the state to align what they say or do and how they act with the principles and values of the Constitution, in distinction and contravention of their own motivated self-interest. That's what corruption is about, right? Placing your own interest over the interests of the institution. Over caste, which is what socially we're all inculcated in, right? So I have a caste, and I'm fully aware of that caste in relation to the institution where I operate as a casteless person. You know, we don't appoint, technically we don't appoint joint secretary because you're a Kshatriya or a Brahmin or anything of the sort. So we're supposed to be casteless in an institution. The problem is, of course, that without constitutional morality, caste is precisely the kind of thing that we use for promotion. You may ask yourself why in the entire country of India and this enormous bureaucracy we have only one scheduled caste secretary to the government of India. This is outrageous. It's criminal. And it is explainable by the fact that constitutional morality has not diffused into the public agents of the state. So, the strict sense of constitutional morality is a binding commitment on the agents of the state. So what about the rest of us? So someone has asked, isn't Pratap basically saying that constitutional morality is submission to adjudicatory mechanisms or democratic processes created by the Constitution? Yes and no. Who is supposed to do that? So what Ambedkar is talking about is a distinction now between constitutional morality, which is public reason in the strict sense, and a term that he also uses for fraternity, public conscience. Now, most of us aren't public officials. Does that mean that we are not to practice fraternity in some sort? No, absolutely not. Fraternity gets realized in terms of public agency as constitutional morality, and it gets realized in terms of the rest of us as public conscience. Now, public conscience is a term that Dr. Ambedkar used back in 1936 in Annihilation of Caste. When he speaks of fraternity, he says that public conscience is, and I quote, conscience which becomes agitated at every wrong, no matter who is the sufferer. And it leads an individual to join the struggle to remove that wrong. Again, no matter who is the sufferer. Now you understand that public conscience then is what Ambedkar calls fellow feeling, because it is not an identity in association with having to distribute benefits amongst my caste and try to externalize burdens away from my caste. It is instead the social agreement to distribute benefits and burdens fairly among society as a whole, irrespective of caste. And so if you see a person suffering an injustice, whether he or she is of your caste or not, your conscience gets ignited. I hope it is not blasphemous to say that this is rather in the face of that one passage of Krishna's advice or injunction to Arjuna that his feelings should only be ignited in relation to his caste. So what Dr. Ambedkar says is caste has killed public spirit. Caste has destroyed the sense of public charity. Caste has made a truly public opinion impossible. A Hindu's public is his caste, and his responsibility is only to his caste. And so, this being the social background, in order to achieve fraternity, both as a public and a private citizen, you need to practice constitutional morality and public conscience. And so what fraternity is then doing is it is attempting to overcome two overlapping contradictions, incommensurabilities. The incommensurability of our democratic institutions, which champion liberty and equality, and our undemocratic social milieu, where caste dictates the practices opposite to our democratic principle. So for both of these, as well as for the conceptual problem of incommensurability, fraternity has to bear the burden. It does so at the level of institutions in the forms of constitutional morality. It does so at the social level in the form of public conscience. It does so at the conceptual level as the root and source of both liberty and equality. So what we see is contradiction, 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 and the need to resolve contradiction. And when we look at 4th November, 1948, we see top dressing on an Indian soil. And when we look at 25 November 1949, we see the word contradiction explicitly. You're probably all familiar with the 25 November 1949 speech. At least you better be. I had asked you to read it. I'll say some of it, recite some of it. We must make our political democracy a social democracy. Political democracy cannot last unless there lies at the base of it a social democracy. Now, what does social democracy mean? It means a way of life which recognizes liberty, equality, and fraternity as the principles of life. These principles are not to be treated as separate items. They form a union. To divorce one from the other defeats the very purpose of democracy. Liberty cannot be divorced from equality. Equality cannot be divorced from liberty. Both of them cannot be divorced from fraternity. Okay, now I'll skip down. We must begin by acknowledging the fact that there is a complete absence of two things in Indian society. One of these is equality. On the social plane, we have in India a society based on the principle of graded inequality, which means the elevation for some and the degradation for others. Now, on the 26th of January 1950, we are going to enter into a life of contradictions. In politics, we will have equality, and in social and economic life, we will have inequality. This life of contradictions is the same as the top dressing on the Indian soil from the year before, or another very often cited phrase of Dr. Ambedkar's. He said that he found the Constitution to be workable and flexible and strong enough to hold the country together. Indeed, if I may say so, if things go wrong under the new Constitution, the reason will not be that we had a bad Constitution. What we will have to say is that man was vile. All right, so we have workable Constitution versus man is vile. We have life of contradictions and this top dressing on Indian soil and so on. So we have this continuous articulation of incommensurability. not the conceptual one, but the legal versus social one. I think we're about to get cut off again. And there are only a few minutes left, but I'm sorry, this is going to stop, so we'll just have to rejoin one more time. Okay, we have most people back. Okay, so we're keeping on trying to fixate on all of the tasks that fraternity was meant to perform in the preamble as a fundamental value for sustaining or giving the Constitution its spirit. So fraternity is a concept that has all of these virtues, and it's natural that Dr. Ambedkar made so many demands on it. The history of Western political philosophy already relied on it for the either by its own names or using other names to solve its conceptual dead ends, that zero-sum problem between liberty and equality. And it was an effective tool for them because it had this dual use capability, having both a cognitive side and an affective side. And fraternity, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, has a genealogy that's traced back to stories of Jesus Christ and the pilgrims. That's its historical origin. And it still has this residue of communitarian value, so like a communitarian warmth and love. And in this respect, it was a concept of a very different flavor from political concepts. You could even feel this linguistically by the way that we attach different kinds of prepositions. So liberty, I've described in terms of negative and positive. So freedom from or freedom to, these prepositions from and to, and equality, equality of opportunity or equality before the law. Fraternity uses always a different preposition, with. So it's not an affrontation directed at you. It's not something taken from you. It's just this community sense of being with. So fraternity has always had a different kind of flavor. It's a political concept from a very different genealogical community background. So what we see then is that it even its own Western iterations perfectly harmonize Dr. Ambedkar's way of articulating it as being an essentially Buddhist concept. So I had mentioned the last speech of his life. I will quote from it. Just I think about 14 days before he dies, he says this: "Society has been aiming to lay a new foundation, summarized by the French Revolution in 3 words: fraternity, liberty, and equality. The French Revolution was welcomed because of this slogan, but it failed to produce equality. We then welcomed the Russian Revolution because it aimed to produce equality, but it cannot be too much emphasized that in producing equality, society cannot afford to sacrifice liberty. So you see the evocation of 2 things: the French Revolution with liberty, equality, and fraternity, but the claim that it was unable to produce equality, it was just a bourgeois revolution. Then the Russian Revolution, which, contrary to being a bourgeois revolution, was a kind of proletarian revolution. But there we get this concept of justice, social, economic, and political, which Ambedkar had again championed. But the Russian Revolution, while producing equality, crushed liberty. To continue his speech, equality will be of no value without fraternity or liberty. It seems that the 3, liberty, equality, and fraternity, can only coexist if one follows the way of the Buddha. Now, I hope you can see the way this long, wending argument has kind of come full circle, where Dr. Ambedkar says that what he championed as the core of his social philosophy is liberty, equality, and fraternity, but let no one think that he took this from the French Revolution. Rather, he learned it from his teacher, the Buddha. And then his further articulation, this is in around 1951, where he finally summarizes what fraternity in the Preamble means. What sustains equality and liberty is fellow feeling. What the French revolutionaries called fraternity. But the word fraternity is not an adequate expression. The proper term for what I mean is what the Buddha called Maitri, or Metta. So what we see in Dr. Ambedkar's own interpretation of the word fraternity, which beyond any historical doubt was introduced by Ambedkar into the Preamble in defiance of the Constituent Assembly's dictate that he should follow the objectives resolution, was the introduction of the term fraternity, which he fully internally understood to be Maitri or Metta, as the necessary condition for sustaining goodwill, fellow feeling, amongst a deeply divided, caste-ridden, inegalitarian society. And so the weight of the concept of fraternity in the Preamble is in some respects the total gravitational center for how to resolve the contradictions of the egalitarian freedoms articulated in the Constitution with India's social, real lived social life. So fraternity is in some respects the nucleus of the Preamble, and that nucleus is understood by Ambedkar to be Metta or Maitri, and why this or how this term articulates itself in different domains like constitutional morality or public conscience or goodwill is the key to understanding how Dr. Ambedkar thinks that the contradiction between the Constitution and the Indian ideology, which remains inegalitarian, will eventually be resolved so that the revolution that is the Constitution will be a different sort of revolution from the French and the Russian. And in this respect, I think the we see an enormous unity of the wide range of Dr. Ambedkar's political, juridical, and religious thinking with the basic structure of the preamble, not only on the February 6th, the form it originally took on February 6th, but even on 21st Feb, if not more so, because what we see between 6th and 21st Feb is the ability of the drafting committee to introduce, in a spirit of goodwill and unity, terms of concession to both leftist and nationalists, so that a preamble can be produced that carries wide-scale possibility of overlapping consensus. Now, I'll leave off, I'll stop there on fraternity. We'll come back to a few issues, of course, because the last two concepts, dignity and nation, are in fact concepts that are within the Fraternity Clause. We discussed the Justice Clause, which is individual, and Ambedkar said justice is really nothing other than liberty, equality, and fraternity. And then we discussed the Liberty Clause, the Equality Clause, and now the Fraternity Clause. But we'll come back in some respects because the dignity and nation concepts are sub-clauses of the Fraternity Clause.